Because our speakers and questioners have been so orderly, I've told Matthew he can just take his time. Our next speaker is Matthew Page, who's going to talk to us about reproducible research practices in systematic reviews.
Okay, so that means I'll be up here for half an hour, just warning you. All right, so thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to present again. I think the only reason for that is because they needed a quota of Australian speakers to attend on the podium, so that's me this year. But I appreciate it nonetheless. Now, what I want to talk about, excuse me, what I want to talk about in this session, whoops. Okay, one slide's going fast.
This one's, yeah.
Oops, let's go back. There we go. Okay, so what I want to talk about in this session is reproducible research practices in the context of systematic reviews. And so what I mean by reproducible research practices are those practices used by authors of studies which would allow others to attempt to follow the methods and reproduce the finding of studies given the data that's actually available. And so there's been a lot of talk about we need more reproducible research being published, but a lot of the attention and guidance seems to be going towards authors of clinical trials and individual studies. And I think we should hold a systematic reviewers to the same account. And so some of the examples of practices I'm talking about are things like providing a detailed description of the data gathered and used in analyses, providing clear presentation of the analysis methods and results, and sharing data sets collected and statistical analysis used, which underpins the analyses reported in a systematic review. Because there's many benefits of doing this in a context of a systematic review. For example, it can allow for reanalysis of meta-analyses, whereby a reader who wants to maybe do a subgroup analysis on a set of trials that are applicable to a certain clinical practice that you're working in, you may be able to do that if you have that data available from within the paper. It also allows others to check for errors and allows others to cumulatively add new data once it becomes available. We're moving into a world in systematic reviews of living systematic reviews, whereby we want to be able to have timely evidence produced. And so making our data sets fully reported and shareable can help facilitate that. But it's not really clear how often review authors actually use practices like this. So using the same sample of reviews that I referred to and discussed yesterday, we looked at a sample of 110 systematic reviews of therapeutic interventions that were indexed in Medline in February 2014, where we had no restriction on the type of journal or clinical condition or specialty. There was 32 Cochrane reviews and 78 non-Cochrane reviews. And some of the practices, I'll go through more of the practices in a minute when I show you the results, but examples of things that we were looking at from the articles and from the online appendices available and any links to any online links provided was things like whether the authors fully report and make it clear which studies and study data are included in meta-analyses. We're also checking if they state not only if they obtained or sought data from trialists, but which specific data were obtained. So we see lots of reviewers just including a generic statement such as, if data were unclear, we contacted the authors. But then you have no idea when you come to read a meta-analysis, is this based purely on published data, or is it based on data that I've manipulated in some way, or is it based on data that's been obtained that was unpublished? And we also wanted to see if the authors of reviews make their data sets and statistical analysis code available. And so we had one author review these practices in 80% of the reviews, and then 20% of the reviews were evaluated in duplicate, and then any items that were discrepant between the two authors in that 20% sample were considered problematic items which needed checking in the original 80% sample for verification. Now, in terms of, did I go too fast again? Okay. In terms of reporting enough information to allow one to attempt to recreate a meta-analysis, this is actually what I mean. So when you're looking at a meta-analysis, I want to know, have the authors indicated which studies were included, what's the effect estimate and precision for each included study, what's the meta-analytic effect estimate and precision, and which model was used. If I have that information, then I'm able to go ahead and try and recreate that meta-analysis. Now, some people in the room who publish systematic reviews may be thinking, well, all of that information under that green box there is on a forest plot. So clearly this is a useless study because all systematic reviews and meta-analyses will be reproducible. But that's not always the case. So some authors will only report the meta-analytic effect without making it clear which studies were included and how data were coded and included in the analysis. Or they'll just include a narrative description of the results, where they say, for example, that our meta-analysis of pain showed no significant difference. So we wanted to quantify that and other issues. So across the 110 reviews that we evaluated, or we included, I should say, there was a total of over 2,000 meta-analyses that we evaluated. And we found that 73% of these meta-analyses could, in theory, be recreated from the data reported. I should have said could in theory, because if you post a photo of this and put it online, people will think that I'm insane in that I actually attempted to recreate 2,000 meta-analyses, and that's not what I did. I was really just looking at how they were reported and whether that could have been done. But what I mean, the caveat of that is that obviously 27%, so 588 of these meta-analyses, we wouldn't have been able to attempt to recreate these analyses at all because it was, for example, unclear which studies were included and which data had been included in the analysis. Now, across all of the reviews, all 110 reviews, we found that only 65% reported the data needed to recreate all meta-analyses. Reviewers were more likely to report the data needed to recreate the primary meta-analysis, which occurred in about 90% of the reviews. Now, those authors that included a statement along the lines of, we manipulated the data in some way prior to its inclusion in the analysis, such as combining 2 arms in a 3-arm trial, we found that authors only specified which specific data had been manipulated in about 40% of reviews. Those authors that said that they obtained data from trialists, it was really only clear in 43% which specific data had been obtained and then subsequently included in the analysis. And only 30% of the reviews made a data set and statistical analysis code available. And with that bottom characteristic there, you could argue it's a somewhat generous our rating there, because what we're referring to really is only the Cochrane reviews, which I think even some authors of Cochrane reviews may not be aware about the fact that when they actually publish their article, a link to a downloadable review manager file becomes available, which the data can be edited and you can use the different models that are available within that software. So that's automatically done whenever Cochrane reviews are published. Now, I did look at whether the practices differed across Cochrane and non-Cochrane reviews, and we did find that in general, quite clearly, a lot of these practices were more often used in the Cochrane reviews. So just looking at that top one there, we found nearly all Cochrane reviews report the data needed to recreate all meta-analyses, but only half of the non-Cochrane reviews do that. And again, I think that's because Cochrane reviews work off software that actually helps facilitate this clear, transparent reporting of the data available. We also wanted to see whether people who claimed that they used the PRISMA statement were more likely to use these reproducible research practices. But we actually found that there wasn't that much difference between the types of reviews. So even perhaps surprisingly, looking at those top 2 bars, counterintuitively, those authors who said that they worked off the PRISMA statement was slightly less likely to report all the data needed to recreate all meta-analyses, perhaps because these sort of practices are not completely explicit in the current version of the guideline. Now, some strengths of this work are that we included a broad cross-section of systematic reviews, looking at published in a range of specialty journals and looking at a range of clinical areas, and performed a detailed evaluation of these reproducible research practices. Some limitations are that we didn't go that extra level to attempt to try and reproduce the meta-analyses ourselves. That's something we could do in future work and see if we're actually able to come up with the same result had we tried to search for exactly the same trials and collect the same type of data. We also didn't contact the authors of the reviewers to request the information that we needed, which is something that we would probably do in practice if we actually did want to go and recreate the findings. And we only looked at reviews published in English, which had to meet some minimum quality criteria. So it's possible that our findings don't generalize to other types of systematic reviews. And some implications from this work are we think that review authors need to make greater use of software to help them transparently report their meta-analysis findings and share all the data that they've collected. So software like the Systematic Review Data Repository, an open access database that people can use to deposit the data they've collected as part of a systematic review, which is helpful when you're thinking about coming ahead and doing future reviews where you're not going to have to always contact authors every single time for the data that you need, because if it's all in this central database, then that could actually help everyone in future. And they could also share more of their results in extra analyses on platforms like the Open Science Framework and Figshare, because obviously it's hard to fit everything into a single article. And I remember one of the peer reviewer comments I got on this abstract was, do you expect the results of a study to be reproducible entirely from an article? And no, I don't expect it to be just from the article alone. I expect authors to make use of links to these different platforms and software, because it's always obviously helpful to make their article usable and readable too, rather than bombarding them with too much information. So in conclusion, we think that reproducible research practices are underused in systematic reviews of therapeutic interventions, and that we need to invest in strategies such as updating of PRISMA guidelines and development of software that can help facilitate authors to provide more detailed descriptions of their data gathered and used, more transparent reporting of the analysis method and results, and sharing of the data sets and code. And all the data, code, and materials for this study are available on the Open Science Framework at this website here. I've been seeing other people have been putting barcodes on their slide, and clearly I'm too old for that because I have no idea how that was done. So you're just going to have to type out the website here. So thank you.
While we wait for questions, I'll ask one, if I may, which I'm going to express as naively as I can. To what extent should it be the case that if someone redoes a systematic review, they get exactly the same result?
Well, I mean, if they have gone ahead and intended to collect exactly the same data from the study, if the authors had made it clear exactly which particular outcome measures and time points and analytic results that they've found, then they should, I think, be able to replicate the original finding, but then, of course, they do have the option to use a different model or to use different data available in the studies. So I think that choice is available too, but I think it would be good for them to at least check that they have found the same set of studies and same set of data.
Let's go this way first.
Yeah, Andreas Lund from the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine in Denmark. Thank you for an interesting presentation. I was wondering, for the group of non-Cochrane reviews, did you look at whether the journals they published in actually allowed for supplementary information to be uploaded? Because I would imagine if you do a lot of sensitivity or subgroup analysis, that you wouldn't be able to fit them into a paper with a forest plot.
Yep, so we will look at that. We haven't looked at that yet, but obviously I think a lot of journals are offering that as an option for now, but that's something that we do need to check if that was available. So good point.
And then over here.
Hal Sox from Picori. Part of reproducible research as applied to systematic reviews would be being able to reproduce the assessment of the quality of the individual studies that ended up being included. And I wondered whether your analysis took that into account, or whether you basically started with the studies that they indicated that they included.
We just started with the studies that they indicated they included. So we really were only looking at the reproducibility of the actual meta-analytic results. So we could have looked at whether the searches were reproducible and whether the assessments of validity were, but that was beyond the scope of this. But it's something we could attempt to do.
Yeah, well, my talk yesterday talked about how hard it was to make reproducible assessments of individual elements of study quality. So I think that's a serious element that you need to add.
Okay.
So great talk.
We go back that way.
Hi, I'm Holly Nardini from the Medical Library at Yale University. And you just alluded to what my point is going to be, which is I think we need to broaden our understanding of data when we talk about this, because I think you're mostly talking about analysis of data and meta-analyses, but when we talk about the systematic review, it's so fundamental that we can reproduce the search. And as a librarian, I'm so often on systematic review teams where we're asked to reproduce something, and the most discouraging thing I can see is searches available from the authors.
Yep.
And there's not often an attempt to catalog those or include those even in the supplements, if not in the main body of the article. And searches are so often not fully described.
Yep.
So I'm delighted with some of this that you're suggesting here, but I would also encourage people to think about putting the searches on OSF or other platforms where those can be reproduced.
Yep, absolutely. And even that's something has already been recommended in Prisma since 2009.
Yes,
Please provide the line-by-line line-by-line search strategy. And I think in our previous study, which we did publish in PLOS Medicine last year, I think we only found maybe less than half of the reviews were doing that. Otherwise, it's just maybe we searched these databases using a couple of these text words, which not putting it all together means that then, of course, you're not able to replicate that at all.
So I think this is a great bit of data and a great presentation. My question is, every systematic review should begin with a protocol, and I think you're looking at the final piece of the puzzle where you're asking about the statistical reproducibility. But we know that a lot of the clinical trials that are included in these reviews have many different outcomes that could be included. We're now asking trialists to register the domain, the measure, the metric, the method of aggregation, the time point on clinicaltrials.gov. Ian Saldana has done some work showing that systematic reviews don't identify those elements of an outcome in their protocols. And so I wonder if we take a step back and start thinking about whether you could reproduce the analysis from protocol through to completion, do you think that the reproducibility would be lower, and what do you think we should do to reduce that problem?
Yep, I think if you looked back at the protocols of reviews, I think probably the reproducibility would have been lower if you were trying to go from there, because I think authors obviously can't anticipate everything in terms of what they're going to find. And so, well, that's the excuse that people have traditionally used to not pre-specify in much detail exactly what analyses and outcomes they're going to be focusing on. But I think that we could be encouraging greater use of decision rules or hierarchies of data that you might want to access if it's available. And so I know you yourself, plugging Evan Mayo Wilson's work here, has also looked at this issue of specifying a lot more detail in our outcomes in systematic reviews. And I think things like including statements like, if I'm going to come across multiple pain scales, I will pick this one using a hierarchy of scales or a hierarchy of time points or analytical methods to help get over I help facilitate that reproducibility and not force people to take a guess about which data actually ended up being included in the analysis. And so I've done some work looking at multiplicity of data in trials and trying to attempt to identify which effect from a trial was included, and it was often impossible to find out because, like I said, you don't know if it was combined in a certain way by the trialist first, retrieved from the author, or just randomly picked. So greater pre-specification, while acknowledging that you can't anticipate everything, would be ideal. Thanks.
Thanks, Toby Lasserson from Cochrane. And I guess, I mean, what I'm really interested in is, funnily enough, is errors, because if people didn't make mistakes, I'd be out of a job. And so what I'm really interested in the work that I do is spotting errors in forest plots. So your talk was really interesting to me, because one of the things that we try and do as far as we can when we're looking at reviews or evaluating reviews is kind of retrace some of those steps around data collection, data entry, data manipulation, adjustments, so on and so forth. I know you weren't deliberately, intentionally looking at that, but I'd be very interested to know whether you've got any plans to go that one step further and sort of, for a sample or for maybe a very sort of select few reviews sampled randomly from what you've got, to repeat the analyses, but actually involve looking at the data again, going back to the study levels rather than just looking at what's in the plots.
That wasn't my initial plan, but Toby, clearly you're offering to collaborate, so we can talk over the poster session if you'd like. I personally feel I'm done to death looking at this data set. So I would definitely need to recruit several people who might want to be involved in doing that, because it would definitely be worthwhile doing. I'm not disparaging the idea, it is a great idea, but we need...
Well, one of the reasons I'm asking is that I was made aware of an article that I think was published in Nature a few years ago, where this whole approach, actually not just looking at the forest plots, but going back to the searches and the risk of bias assessments, and it kind of failed. So I kind of want to know if that's still likely to happen now, and what might we do to mitigate some of that. But yeah, I'd be happy to collaborate.
Yeah, great. Cool.
Thanks.
Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you very much to all three of our speakers. And we now have the poster break with all the nice healthy snacks upstairs.